Hey everyone, nice to see you all in here for today's class. So for today, what we'll be talking about is science as a method of inquiry more generally. So might be wondering exactly what does a philosopher of science do? Well, a philosopher of science, there are also historians of science. So every philosopher of science knows quite a lot about the history of science, whether it be the history of psychology or biology, physics, chemistry. And the idea is by looking at the history of science and how we've progressed so much in this area of inquiry called science, we can have a better understanding of how to make our scientific methods better, more precise, and well equipped for creating technology and all the wonderful stuff we take for granted via science. So, for this week's lectures, the focus will really be on defining and understanding what we mean by this method of inquiry called science, as well as discussing some of the history of science, at least in the Western world. More specifically, let me write this in the chat. We're going to learn a little bit about the history of science. Now, I'm restricting the history of science again to science in the Western world. Um, but as I'll mention, a lot of the ideas that were very influential to those like Copernicus and Sir Francis Bacon, who kind of helped generate the scientific revolution, they're very much influenced by, thinkers and philosophers from the Eastern world. So it's kind of an interesting overlap. We'll also identify the assumptions behind science. So we started talking about the assumptions behind science last class. Notice scientists have to just brutally assume that we live in an orderly and predictable universe. Why? Because we can't ever really provide any evidence or argument for this because we don't know that the future will conform to the past. So we just assume it. That's what we mean by an assumption. We just take it for granted that it's true, without actually being able to establish that it is in fact true. We also talked about the assumption of simplicity. I'll talk about that more when I'm talking about Copernicus, and then later in a next video when I talk about how scientists adjudicate between or like pick better versus worse hypotheses. Okay. Then we're going to consider some limitations of science. So, despite science being such a powerful tool to help us explain things about the world and to explain things about our universe and our place in it, it's not limitless. There are certain questions science cannot possibly answer, and we'll talk about some of those questions. Then we will discuss the various relationships between science and religion. More specifically, I will map out the four possible positions any person could take with regards to the relationship between science and religion. So, like, this will exhaust all the possible positions you could take with regards to science and religion and how they relate. And then it's kind of up to you to decide which, position you like best or which best suits you. Um, then we'll study the scientific method. So, as we all know, what relates all the sciences, whether it be psychology or biology or chemistry or physics, is that all of these areas follow a certain methodological approach, namely what we call now the scientific method. So, what is the scientific method? Who came up with it? How do we come up with it? Et cetera, et cetera. What are the various steps in the scientific method? And then finally, we will talk about how scientists, like the various kind of rules or, again, assumptions they use to distinguish between good hypotheses and bad ones. So, good hypotheses and junk or pseudoscientific ones. Um, so, more on that to come. So, now in the chat, you'll see these are like kind of our learning goals for this week. But before we get started with the history, and so it's important just to consider like what is science? How do you define this concept? So maybe you can even, I know I have something written up here on the board. You could even pause the video and kind of think to yourself, well, what exactly is um, science? How would you define it? Now, one way that a person can define science, which makes a lot of sense, is that it's this active process we're engaged in, right? It's a method of inquiry where we reason from observable facts to testable explanations for those facts. So it's something that we do. It's like an active process, and this process helps us get at truths about the world and the universe. So when I say it's a method of inquiry where we reason from observable facts to testable explanations for those facts, what I really mean is that in science, notice the process goes something like this. You identify some pattern in the world, right? So some observable fact that's patterned, some kind of thing that keeps happening over and over again. Um, so some like new problem, let's say. And from there, you try to come up with an explanation for why that thing is happening or how that thing is happening. Why is this pattern, why has this pattern emerged? How has it emerged? And that's when we come up with a testable explanation for the facts that we observe. Now, that testable explanation is what we oftentimes call a hypothesis. Now, here's an example to make this point hopefully more clear. Since 2016, we've been noticing there's been a rapid decline in the bee population. So bees have been, their population rates have been declining quite rapidly since 2016. This is an observed pattern or an observed kind of fact that we're noticing in our world, that each year the bee population declines. Now, that is the first part. The second part is developing an explanation for this fact that we observe. So maybe my explanation is the reason why we have seen the bee population go down since 2016 is because the use of certain pesticides or the emission of certain chemical toxins or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now notice here I am presenting a testable explanation for the pattern I see, the decreasing number of bees. And then as a good scientist, I will go and test that. Science is also sometimes used as like a noun. It's not always used in this like action-based like verb kind of way. And when we use it as a noun, what we just mean is like science is this body of knowledge that we have kind of derived over human history by finding ourselves utilizing this process called the scientific method. So that's just one more thing to know. Now, of course, it's impossible really to talk about science without talking a little bit about the history of science. One reason is because, surprisingly enough, the concept of science itself, when you look at human history and you look at all the things that we've known for so long, this process of science is actually quite new. So, at least in the Western world. So in the Western world, let me actually now erase this. So in the Western world, we get what's called the scientific revolution around the 17th century, okay? Which just implies, again, that science was not always a part of how us humans thought and reasoned about the world. And now let me ask you, prior to the scientific revolution in the Western world, during the 17th century, how do you think that most people got knowledge about the world? So, of course, us human beings are interested in our place in the world and what's out there. And so you might ask yourself, before this scientific revolution in the Western world, how did ordinary people like me and you come to know anything? Um, and now, it sounds like a trickier question than it is. If you kind of pause the video and think about it, prior to the scientific revolution, what institution was responsible for disseminating all the possible knowledge a person could have? And if you're still not sure, that entity or that organization is the Catholic Church. So prior to, I'll just put scientific, I'll just write it, scientific revolution. Okay. So prior to the scientific revolution, how did people get any knowledge about the world? Well, it was directly through the church, right? The idea is that, God created us and God sends out down his teachings and really wants us to know certain things based on the Bible. So the Catholic Church prior to the scientific revolution was the main disseminator of information, not just information about spirituality or God or faith, but also information about the actual world. Um, okay, so another thing that's interesting to note is this word science itself is quite new. So we've not always had this word, called called science. It actually, the term was kind of developed during the 17th century. So, kind of another interesting little fact is that science itself is a new term. It's a new word. It's a new way of like thinking of how we can obtain knowledge or facts about the world. Prior to the scientific revolution in the Western world, the people who took on roles similar to our modern day scientists, they called themselves natural philosophers. So natural meaning like philosophers of the natural world. Okay? So science wasn't even a word till quite recently, which is interesting. Now, as I mentioned, um, what was the big organization or entity that was considered the final source of truth in the Western world prior to the scientific revolution? Well, it's again the church, right? The church really tells us all we need to know about what has happened on this planet. Now, there are a few key figures in that are that really kind of help generate the scientific revolution. And so now we have to talk a little bit about these very important figures in science. I'm sure you got all this. Okay. So there are kind of, I would say, like three major people during the scientific revolution. Your book only discusses two of them, so I'll kind of just focus on the two that the book discusses, but I would say that there's other people to consider as well. So in the book, we consider the astronomer, Nicholas Copernicus. Okay. Nicholas Copernicus. Now, in the Western world, so I'll just put WD for Western, or WWE for Western world. In the Western world, up until around the time that Copernicus is doing his work, which is kind of more in the 16th century, so 1473 to he lived until, let's see, 1534 or 1543. Sorry. Yeah, so prior to the scientific revolution, people interested in the natural world called themselves natural philosophers. And now in the Western world, Nicholas is very much accredited for kind of helping to launch the scientific-led revolution. Now that kind of just begs the question, you might just be wondering, well, what exactly did he do that was so important? So, what did he do? Why is he so important to us in the Western world as a scientifically minded community? Well, Nicholas Copernicus is responsible for, in the Western world, popularizing the heliocentric model of the solar system or of planetary orbits. So prior to the scientific revolution, prior to sci revolution, as I just mentioned, the church was the sole kind of disseminator of information and facts and knowledge about the world. And so, prior to the scientific revolution, the Catholic Church held a certain view concerning how planets orbit. Okay, and the model or view that they presented is what we call the geocentric model of planetary orbits. So this is prior to Copernicus's work. Now, what's this geocentric model? The geocentric model of planetary orbits is just this idea that the Earth is the center of our solar system, and all the various planets, including the Sun, and here's Venus, they all move around the Earth in this type of way. I'll explain why I'm doing the photos in just a moment. In this type of way. Now, I'm going to send a follow-up video to kind of better explain what's going on here, but let me try my best to do so. So first of all, why again does the Catholic Church, why are they so hung up on this narrative that the Earth is the center of the planetary orbits? Why is it so important that the Earth be the center? Well, now think about it. We're supposed to be the pinnacle of God's creation, right? That's what it says in texts like the Bible. And given that we're the pinnacle of God's creation, it wouldn't make much sense, therefore, to say that the center, not only of our solar system, but of even the entire universe, is somehow not Earth. So think about it like this: like if you have well, actually, maybe I won't do the analogy, but think about it like this: like if you again believe that God is Almighty and God can save us from any kind of natural disaster, and it's all in God's plan, you might find yourself respecting the positions the Catholic Church takes on issues over and above the everyday scientists like Copernicus. Okay? So, all this to say, in a lot of ways, what Copernicus did, and later Galileo, was quite selfless. It was justified by the by our pursuit of knowledge. Sorry. So the idea is that the church thought that Earth has to be the center of not just our solar system, but of the whole universe, because we're the pinnacle of God's creation. And we see Copernicus kind of challenge this idea. So let's get into some of that. Now, what is Copernicus responsible for? As I just mentioned, he's responsible for, in the Western world, putting or positing this idea that it's the sun that's the center of the planetary orbits, and that all planets revolve around the sun. Okay. Now you might also be wondering, like, why? So it looks definitely appears like Columbus's Copernicus. I keep saying Columbus. I'm sorry. Copernicus is. You may be noticing that Copernicus's kind of picture of the planetary orbits is a lot simpler and more clear than the church's, where the church again claims that the Earth is the center of the planetary orbits. So heliocentric is when the sun is the center, and then geocentric is the view of the church, where the Earth is the center. Okay. Now a little bit just about what's going on here. Before this is of course again being very much relating very specifically and precisely to